Why would a woman build a bamboo house, deep in the middle of an American forest? That's exactly what everyone in town asked. And when she refused to explain, they laughed. They called her crazy, delusional. Some even said she'd lost her mind after her father died. But what they didn't know was that beneath that bamboo cabin buried for decades was a $100 million secret tied to forgotten families, Cold War corruption, and a truth so explosive. Someone once tried to erase it forever. She was the woman they mocked until the day the forest gave up its secret. Stay with this story because what she uncovered was never just about money. It was about justice, legacy, and redemption. Let's get started. The morning fog clung to the Carolina pines like whispered promises never kept. Maya Ellison stood at the edge of her hand-built bamboo porch, bare feet pressing into the cool wood, a half-empty mug of chamomile tea warming her fingers. She was 36, younger than most would expect for someone who'd turned her back on city life to live in a handcrafted bamboo cabin deep in the woods. To the folks in nearby Hollow Creek, a dusty southern town where gossip traveled faster than lightning, Maya was either an eccentric artist or a lost soul chasing ghosts. They called her the Bamboo Girl, mostly behind her back, sometimes to her face. The cashier at the general store once offered her a pamphlet for a women's support group, mistaking independence for instability. But Maya didn't flinch. She'd once been an award-winning sustainable architect in Austin, the kind with TED Talks and glossy magazine features. Then, her father, Thomas Ellison, passed away, and everything changed. He left behind a worn leather journal, brittle with age, and a single line written on the back of a weathered photograph. The truth is buried where the roots run deepest. And somehow, Maya knew. He didn't mean that metaphorically. For nearly a year, Maya lived in the shadow of her father's final words, where the roots run deepest. She'd memorized that phrase, whispered it like a prayer as she laid each bamboo pole into place. Every wall, every joint of her cabin felt less like a construction project and more like a ritual, like she was slowly unearthing a secret one beam at a time. And still, she found nothing. No treasure, no map, no revelation. Just long, humid days of solitude and the mocking eyes of Hollow Creek. It was the local kids who mocked her the loudest. They'd come by on their bikes, circling the edge of her clearing like vultures, shouting, "Hey, Bamboo Barbie, building a treehouse for your imaginary friends." She'd wave, never shouted back. What was the point? Even the adults joined in their own polite southern way. "Oh, honey, are you still working on that little project? You know there's good realtors in town, don't you?" Her uncle from Charleston stopped returning her calls entirely. The bank refused to extend her renovation loan. One by one, her old life was fading just as her new one was being doubted, discredited, and discarded. But Maya couldn't walk away. She felt it. Something was here. The turning point came on a stormy Thursday afternoon in September. She had been clearing the underbrush near the edge of her land, the part closest to the creek, a place overgrown with vines so thick they swallowed sunlight. It wasn't somewhere she normally wandered. The bamboo grove she'd planted was in the opposite direction, and the soil here was too rocky for building. But that day, something called her there. Maybe it was the way the air shifted heavy, electric, or the way the birds had fallen silent. Whatever it was, her hands moved like they were chasing a memory. She dropped to her knees, parting the ferns with her machete, when the blade struck something not rock, not root, but a hollow thud, like metal under pressure. She froze, then cleared the dirt faster, hands shaking. It was a box, an old, rusted military-style container with faded letters on the side. To private her father's initials. Maya stared for a long moment. breath caught between disbelief and awe. She hadn't cried in over a year, not since the funeral. But now the tears came slow, silent, reverent. She wasn't crazy. Her father had left her something, and it had been buried here the whole time, just 20 feet from the creek bed. She opened the box. Inside were sealed plastic folders, wrapped carefully in layers of wax paper and cloth, documents, dozens of them, yellowed blueprints, handwritten notes, legal records, and at the very bottom, a slim, weather-worn journal identical to the one he'd left in her possession. But this one was different. This one wasn't philosophical ramblings or half-finished poems. This one was a blueprint to something bigger. It had dates, coordinates, and hand-drawn maps. There were bank references, codes, P.O., boxes traced across 3 states. And stamped across the top of one page in her father's unmistakable handwriting was a single phrase: Operation Acorn Confidential. For hours, Maya sat in her cabin, surrounded by papers that rattled with history. Each detail revealed more than the last. Her father hadn't been just a local surveyor like he claimed. According to the notes, he'd once been contracted by a quiet federal task force in the early 1980s, one tasked with uncovering long-forgotten financial caches hidden across the southeastern United States during the Cold War. The bamboo house. It wasn't just a retreat. It was a landmark, a marker for something deeper, something that had been sealed away and deliberately forgotten. The notes referenced an underground vault system buried somewhere along the property, possibly beneath the rock shelf near the creek. It detailed reinforced concrete structures, false land plats, and a coded locking mechanism requiring both physical keys and a numerical sequence based on historical dates. It was real, and Maya was standing on top of it. By nightfall, thunder cracked across the sky. Rain pelted the bamboo roof like urgent fingers. But Maya didn't sleep. She read. She cross-referenced. She began mapping. With each page, the image grew clearer. Her father had discovered a Cold War-era holding site, one possibly tied to unaccounted funds funneled through shadow programs, possibly worth tens, if not hundreds of millions. It had been meant to fund something called Acorn, a domestic contingency operation that was eventually abandoned and classified. Except someone forgot to clean up the money. Or maybe they meant to forget. And now it was up to her to uncover it, not for greed, not for vengeance, but to finish what her father couldn't, to prove to herself, to the world, and to that smug little town, that she wasn't the fool they made her out to be. As lightning struck in the distance, Maya stood tall beside her blueprint-covered table and whispered the words she'd carried in her bones for a year. "Let the roots show me the way." And this time, she meant it literally. 3 days later, Maya stood ankle-deep in clay and water, digging through the sloped earth just beyond the tree line near the creek bed. She hadn't told anyone, not the town, not the local registry office, not even her estranged brother who lived 2 hours away and still thought she was having some kind of post-burnout nature phase. No, this was between her and her father, between her and the truth. She'd followed the coordinates from the journal to a spot about 30 yards behind her bamboo cabin, just under the ridge where the roots of a long-dead oak clung to fractured rock like bony fingers. Using the old survey maps, she'd marked out what her father had called the access point, and that's where she started to dig. For hours, it was just her, the cicadas, and the quiet scrape of metal against earth. Then the shovel hit something, hollow. Her breath caught. She dropped to her knees and began to clear the soil with her hands, heart pounding so loud she barely heard the thunder that rumbled low in the distance. It was a steel hatch. Old, rusted, bolted shut with a locking mechanism that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. It bore no markings, only a 3-digit number pad and a strange emblem stamped into the center, an acorn, etched into a triangle. Operation Acorn, just like the journal had said. Maya wiped her palms on her jeans, pulled out her father's notebook, and flipped to the page with the codes. There, in block letters, enter 1, 9 to 5. Do not force. If the light turns red, stop. She took a breath and keyed in the numbers. A dull beep. Then silence. For a second, nothing happened. Then a mechanical click echoed from inside the hatch, followed by a low, grinding sound as the bolts slowly released themselves. Dust coughed from the seams. The entire panel shifted ever so slightly upward, as if the earth itself were exhaling. Maya stared. She had just unlocked something the world had forgotten existed. Inside the hatch was a narrow staircase, steep and damp. She descended slowly, flashlight gripped tight, one hand skimming the concrete wall for balance. The air was musty, but not foul. Preserved. Sealed. At the bottom of the stairs, the tunnel opened into a square chamber, and that's when she froze. Someone had been there recently. There were footprints in the dust. Not hers. Too big, heavier, and recent maybe hours, a day old at most. Maya's heart climbed into her throat. She backed against the wall, switching off the flashlight instinctively and holding her breath. She waited. Nothing moved, no sound except the faint dripping of condensation. Had someone been watching her, following her? She reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out her phone, and quickly snapped photos of the room, the footprints, the walls, the sealed metal vault at the far end with the same Acorn insignia. The feeling of triumph twisted into unease. She wasn't the only one who knew. Back at her cabin that evening, Maya barely noticed the bamboo swaying outside, or the smoke curling from the small fire pit. Her eyes were fixed on the photos she had just taken. The chamber was real. The vault existed. Her father's notes were accurate down to the detail. But who had been down there before her? She flipped to the end of the journal again. A postscript she hadn't read before caught her eye, scribbled hastily in pencil, like it had been added in fear. If anyone contacts you asking about Acorn, don't answer. They're not here for truth. They're here to bury it. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. No caller ID. She hesitated, then answered. A man's voice, calm and clipped, filled the line. Miss Ellison, we need to talk. She stood still, frozen. Who is this? She asked. Let's just say. I work with a group familiar with your father's previous engagements. You've activated something that's sensitive. We suggest you stop. For your safety. Are you threatening me? Silence. Then no. We're giving you a chance to walk away. Not everyone gets one. Click. The line went dead. Maya stood in stunned silence, the weight of her father's legacy suddenly heavier than ever. Later that night, unable to sleep, she returned to the hatch alone. She stood at the top of the stairs, staring down into the dark, that voice still echoing in her mind. We suggest you stop. She almost turned back. Almost. But then she looked down at the worn leather journal in her hands, at the smudged ink, the shaky handwriting, the tiny drawings in the margins, and she remembered her father's final words, whispered through labored breath as she held his hand. I couldn't protect it forever, but maybe you can finish it. Maya, maybe you can make it right. So she took a breath and stepped back into the dark, not just to uncover the truth, but to defend it. The next morning, Maya woke to find her bamboo cabin eerily still. No wind, no birds, No morning deer wandering through the grove like they usually did. Just silence, and a note tucked under the stone she always left by the front door. It was handwritten, on government-issued paper. "You are not alone. Walk away now." There was no signature, no contact, just that chilling sentence. She stood there barefoot on the porch, her tea forgotten, staring into the woods. For the first time since she'd moved out here, the forest didn't feel like home. It felt like a trap. Maya wasn't easily shaken, but something had shifted. Someone had been close enough to her home to leave a note without being seen. And if they knew about the chamber, if they'd been watching her dig, watching her unlock that hatch, then the question wasn't if she was being followed. It was why she hadn't been stopped yet. She spent that day in town. It was the first time she'd left the forest in weeks. She sat at the Hollow Creek Diner, trying to act casual as she flipped through the old local newspaper archives on her laptop. Her father's journal had mentioned Phase 2 hidden in plain sight. She had a hunch that didn't refer to the vault, but something else, maybe a cover story, or a piece of misinformation planted decades ago. And then she saw it. A headline from 1983, Local Water Testing Project Suspended Due to Unusual Geothermal Activity. The article listed several government officials who had quietly surveyed the area where Maya now lived, citing unstable terrain as a reason to shut down the project. But something in the footnotes made her blood run cold. One of the officials quoted was a man named L. Raymond Caldwell, a name she recognized from a sealed file in her father's box, labeled Survivors of Phase 1 Eyes Only. Raymond Caldwell wasn't a geologist. He had worked for the Department of Defense. So what was he doing surveying a creek in rural North Carolina, in the middle of the Cold War? Maya quickly printed the article and made copies of her father's notes, just in case she needed to move fast. She even sent an email with all files attached to a backup cloud drive, just in case the worst happened. That evening, she returned to the chamber. This time, she wasn't there to explore. She was there to confront the possibility that the people who once buried this operation were now trying to erase it. Descending the steps again, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a faint scratch in the concrete wall halfway down. It looked recent, fresh. She ran her fingers along it. It wasn't a scratch. It was a symbol. An acorn, cracked in half. She entered the chamber with her flashlight low, sweeping the floor cautiously. The room was exactly as she left it, except for one thing. The vault door was open. Her stomach flipped. She approached slowly. Inside was another chamber, dimly lit by a low orange glow from emergency lights still running on backup batteries after all these years. The room was filled with crates military style, stamped with serial numbers and banking codes. Each box meticulously catalogued and labeled in her father's handwriting. But the first crate she opened wasn't filled with cash or gold like she might have imagined. It was filled with files, names, dates, photos. All of them belonged to families, most of them immigrants, refugees, or war survivors who had lost everything during Cold War operations. Maya's knees buckled. This wasn't just hidden wealth. This was restitution, an entire operation designed to return stolen or misused government funds to people who had been used and forgotten. Her father hadn't been hoarding treasure. He'd been protecting justice. Suddenly, her flashlight flickered, then died. The room went dark. She froze. A faint sound echoed through the chamber, soft footsteps from the stairwell. She wasn't alone. Maya backed against the crate, holding her breath. A beam of light cut through the darkness. Another flashlight, scanning the chamber. A voice, quiet and deliberate, Miss Ellison. "We told you to stop." The figure stepped closer. A man in a charcoal suit, clean-shaven, mid-50s. Eyes that didn't blink. It was the same voice from the phone. But before she could speak, another voice rang out behind him louder. Gruffer. She's not going anywhere! A second man emerged from the shadows, bearded, denim shirt, and carrying something that looked suspiciously like a hunting rifle. Maya nearly gasped. It was Franklin Boone, a retired park ranger who lived 2 ridges over. The same man who'd once laughed at her bamboo house and said it wouldn't survive its first winter. He looked at her, then at the agent. Get away from her, now! The suited man didn't flinch. Do you understand what's in here, Mr. Boone? Boone gritted his teeth. I understand she's the only one who didn't forget what her father died protecting. You boys, you just want to bury it all again. Maya could barely believe what was happening. The man who once doubted her existence was now defending it. The agent's eyes narrowed. This isn't over. He turned and walked back up the stairs without another word. Boone lowered his rifle, then helped Maya to her feet. I knew your daddy. I didn't understand what he was doing back then. But I do now. And you're not finishing this alone. That night, under the moonlit canopy of pine and bamboo, Maya realized something had shifted forever. The truth was no longer buried. Now it had allies. 2 days after the confrontation in the chamber, Maya sat at her bamboo kitchen table, if you could call it that, a flat slab of salvaged oak perched on handmade legs. Across from her sat Franklin Boone, the former ranger turned unlikely guardian of her father's legacy. He sipped coffee from a chipped enamel mug and nodded toward the pile of documents on the table. You know what this is, don't you? He said. Maya nodded. It's a restitution system. A financial ledger built on conscience. Franklin leaned back, folding his arms. Your dad wasn't protecting treasure. He was protecting stories, lives, payments that were meant to bring closure, and maybe just a little dignity, to people the world forgot. Maya exhaled. The pressure on her chest, the one she'd lived with since the day her father died, was beginning to shift. Not gone, but lighter. Because now she wasn't just following clues, she was fulfilling a promise. Inside the vault, the files were unlike anything she expected. There were over 200 ledgers, each one detailing a unique family history: names, confiscated property, financial losses due to government-sanctioned relocation or military occupation. It wasn't Nazi gold or Cold War cash reserves. It was compensation, leftovers from wartime reparation funds that had somehow never been delivered. Each file had a coded identifier, a paper trail of banking channels, and in many cases, coordinates not for buried money, but for people. Survivors, heirs. Most had migrated to the U.S. Some still lived in Europe. And here it was. All of it, hidden under a bamboo house in the middle of nowhere. Franklin tapped the stack. Someone has to return this, before it gets stolen all over again. Maya looked at him, wide-eyed. You want to distribute it? I want to help you finish what your dad started. That's what he intended. You can feel it in how he documented everything. This was never supposed to be hoarded. It was meant to be released when the time was right. Maya sat back, her mind spinning. Was this the reason her father had trained her in codes and maps as a child? Why he'd taught her how to read blueprints before bedtime? Why he'd whispered lessons about justice as if they were bedtime stories? It had never been about bamboo. The cabin was a cover, a way to build where no one would suspect. And now, that cover had become a gateway. But what Maya didn't expect came the next day. She was reviewing files from the crate marked Phase 3 Unclaimed Recipients when she found a folder with her mother's maiden name. Hargrove. Her mother had died when Maya was 9, a car accident no one talked about. But in this folder were court documents, a Swiss bank ledger, and a notarized record showing that her mother's family had been victims of forced displacement during the Yugoslav wars. Her grandparents had lost everything, including ownership of a textile factory seized by military forces in 1992. A compensation claim had been filed, approved, but the money never reached them. Maya sat frozen, staring at the stamp across the top of the document Payment Held Site, NC Acorn 7. This vault was holding her own family's restitution. Her father hadn't just protected others. He'd protected them. She pressed her hand over her heart, tears rising. All the ridicule, the loneliness, the nights she'd cried into her pillow wondering if she was chasing ghosts, and now, here it was. Proof that her father never abandoned their story. He'd built her childhood on truths too heavy to explain, and now it was time to honor them. That afternoon, Maya and Franklin returned to the vault with a new plan. They would digitize the files, encrypt the records, and build a secure database that could eventually be released to trusted international restitution organizations. Franklin had an old contact, a woman named Ruth Delgado, now a legal advisor for an NGO that specialized in historical justice and asset recovery. She was discreet, respected, and had spent her career fighting for transparency. They would send her the first package, a sample of files, including the banking codes, personal records, and coordinates, enough to prove legitimacy, without revealing everything too soon. That evening, Maya sat beneath the stars on her porch, her fingers stained with ink and dust from 70-year-old ledgers. She looked out at the bamboo swaying in the wind and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose! The kind that doesn't chase headlines or social media approval. The kind you inherit quietly, painfully from someone who trusted you to do the hard things when they were no longer around to do them. And maybe, just maybe, the world would stop laughing soon. The next morning, Maya woke to an email from Ruth Delgado. Subject: Where did you find this message, Maya? This is real. I've never seen documentation this clear, this intact, or this powerful. If what you're saying is true, you've uncovered one of the most significant hidden restitution archives in history. We need to talk. Immediately. Maya stared at the screen, her hands trembling. It had begun. Maya hadn't been back to Charleston in nearly 5 years. Now, as she pulled up in a rented hybrid with crates of scanned documents and her father's journals in the trunk, she felt like a stranger in the place that had once been her whole world. The streets were familiar, but the memories pressed down like fog, soft but suffocating. She was here to meet Ruth Delgado, the legal advisor Franklin had connected her with. But more than that, she was here to face the part of herself she had buried long ago, the woman who once sat behind glass conference rooms, presenting architectural pitches worth millions, smiling through corporate small talk while her soul quietly cracked. That version of Maya had died the day she buried her father. The woman walking into the quiet downtown office today was someone entirely new. Ruth greeted her with a quiet strength, short silver hair, firm handshake, no small talk. "You're your father's daughter," she said, almost in awe. "He came to us once, years ago, told us he had something big. We didn't listen." Maya blinked, surprised. "You knew him?" "Briefly. He told me some things. I thought he was grieving, paranoid. A kind man, but maybe too wrapped up in the past." I was wrong. They sat together in the small meeting room as Maya laid out the digital database she had begun compiling. Names, coordinates, dates, financial routing numbers, forgotten claims, real lives. Ruth flipped through the files in silence, her hands slightly trembling. "My mother's name is in here," she whispered. I didn't expect that." Tears welled in her eyes. She died thinking no one ever remembered what we lost, that it didn't matter, but it was here, all this time. That moment changed everything. It stopped being about the vault, or even the money. It became about stories' voices that had been ignored, shamed, erased. And Maya, the girl once mocked for building a house of bamboo, had become the keeper of those stories. The voice of those silenced. Over the following weeks, Maya, Ruth, and Franklin formed a quiet alliance. They called it the Acorn Initiative, a tribute to her father's mission and the seed of truth he planted decades ago. They worked under the radar, encrypting everything, building protocols for releasing the information without risking political fallout or personal threats. But with each day that passed, Maya felt something inside her shift. She began sleeping again, not from exhaustion, but from peace. She started writing letters to families, to governments, to people who had been lost in the system. She even called her brother. It didn't go well, at first. "You're really still doing this treasure hunt?" he scoffed. "I don't have time for Dad's fantasy journal. You need help. Maya." But she didn't argue. She just mailed him a copy of the file, the one with their mother's name on it. 3 days later, he called back. And for the first time in years, he cried. One night, as she returned to her cabin, she found an envelope taped to her door. No postmark, no return address, just one word written across the front. Respect. Inside was a photograph, a black and white image of her father standing in front of the vault, holding a folder, younger than she'd ever seen him. On the back, scribbled in faded ink. "Some truths are buried because they're dangerous, others because they're holy." She sat on the steps of her porch and wept a long, silent, purifying kind of grief, not just for her father, but for every person whose story had been swallowed by history, buried in red tape and silence. She wept for herself, too, for the girl who once felt small, misunderstood, laughed at, who thought her strength came from proving others wrong. But now she knew better. True strength was building a home on shaky ground, planting bamboo when the world said steel, and believing even when no one else did that truth, no matter how long it's buried, will always find a way to the surface. A month later, Maya received a video message from Bosnia, a woman in her late 70s, sitting beside her grandchildren. She held a letter in her lap. One of Maya's. "Through trembling English," she said, "My husband died thinking no one would ever know what they took from us. But you remembered. You found it. Thank you for giving my children their name back." The camera panned to the children holding a printed photo of Maya's cabin, their eyes full of wonder. That night, Maya didn't light a fire. She sat outside under the moonlight, listening to the wind dance through the bamboo, and whispered into the stillness. "We did it, Dad." 1 year later, the bamboo swayed gently in the autumn breeze, golden light pouring through the canopy like warm honey. What once looked like an odd little house in the middle of nowhere had now become a symbol of resilience, of truth, and of restoration. Maya stood at the edge of her porch, barefoot, just like she had on the very first morning. But she was not the same woman. Not even close! Behind her, the once ridiculed bamboo cabin had evolved hand-carved benches lined the walls. Archival cabinets built from reclaimed wood now housed copies of hundreds of restitution documents, and a solar-powered satellite connection allowed encrypted access to the Acorn Initiative's growing global database. And carved into the wall above the door in her father's handwriting were the words, "Some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to be kept alive." That day, families from 5 different countries gathered in Hollow Creek. No news crews, no big announcements, just quiet reunions, warm embraces, and eyes that hadn't cried in decades finally letting go. Among them was a boy named Luca, only 12, but sharp, thoughtful. His grandfather had been on the original restitution list. When he stepped into the vault, now cleaned and sealed with tempered glass and soft lighting, he turned to Maya and asked, "Why would someone hide something so good?" She crouched beside him and said gently, "Because sometimes good things scare people who've done bad." He nodded and smiled. Maya had faced criticism over the past year. Not everyone celebrated her discovery. Some tried to discredit her. Some questioned her motives. A few even threatened legal action to reclaim what they claimed were unlawfully retained government assets. But Ruth, Franklin, and a growing team of volunteers had her back, and more importantly, the truth had her back. One file at a time, they were returning not just money, but dignity, to families, to forgotten histories, to legacies swept under decades of bureaucracy and silence. But perhaps the most profound moment came on a cold December morning. Snow dusted the bamboo leaves, something rare and beautiful in this part of North Carolina. Maya woke early to a knock at her door. It was a woman tall, elegant, wrapped in a dark green coat. She looked to be in her early 70s, with kind eyes and a softness that felt strangely familiar. "I'm sorry to come without notice," she said, her voice trembling. "My name is Elena Hargrove. Your mother was my cousin." Maya's breath caught. She invited her in, and they sat for hours sharing stories, tears, memories of a woman Maya had barely known, but had carried in her heart every day. Elena had fled Europe during the conflict and had spent decades searching for closure. She never imagined it would come from a bamboo house in the Appalachian woods, built by the daughter of the cousin she once adored. Before she left, Elena took Maya's hands and said, "You didn't just give us money. You gave us back our name, our place in the world, our roots." And just like that, Maya understood. She hadn't just uncovered a secret. She had rebuilt something sacred. A home not just of bamboo and earth, but of memory and honor. Months passed. More letters arrived. Some from families who had received what was owed to them, others from strangers, people who had watched from afar and found courage in her story to pursue their own hidden truths. One came from a woman in Kansas. "They laughed at me when I said I was restoring my grandmother's land. Then I saw your story. Now, I don't care who laughs." Another from Berlin. "My grandfather always believed someone would find what was stolen. You did. Thank you." And slowly, the world began to listen. Today, the Acorn initiative is quietly making waves across the globe, not with headlines, but with healing. No sponsors, no politicians, just people. And it all began with a woman they used to mock, with a bamboo house they called a joke, with a daughter who simply kept going. That night, Maya stood once more on the porch, watching the wind ripple through the trees. The stars blinked above her. The same stars her father had once traced with his finger when he whispered bedtime stories of hidden things waiting to be found. She closed her eyes and smiled. She had found them, not gold, not glory, but truth. And truth, when guarded by love, courage, and quiet defiance, can shake the world. Anyone can change the world if they're brave enough to dig where others won't. As the final light faded behind the Carolina pines, Maya Ellison sat quietly on the porch of her bamboo cabin, not to rest, but to draft a new letter this time, addressed to a family in Croatia who had no idea their lost inheritance had been found. But this wasn't just about records and vaults anymore. It was about restoration, for the names that had been erased, for the families who'd been forgotten, and for every soul who had ever been told, "Let it go, the past is the past." The woman once mocked for building a house from bamboo had become the architect of something far greater, a living monument to truth, built with her own hands, her father's legacy, and an unshakable belief that quiet defiance is still a kind of power. Because for Maya, and for those she's now helping rise, the truth was never meant to be buried. It was meant to set people free. The end. Up next, 2 more stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Click to keep uncovering the truth with us, and hit subscribe if you believe some dreams are worth digging for.